Hey, hello everyone. Let's go ahead and start. Shayla will get the refuge and bodhicitta prayer on the screen. And then I'll talk a little bit about this course. And then I'm not sure if we'll do a meditation or not. I don't know that we need to do one today. We'll do one at the beginning of the future classes. So again, this verse that we're going to recite together, we're going to do this first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. This is just reaffirming whatever sort of confidence we have in the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, as well as the Buddha who taught them and those who practice these teachings. And then generating the motivation of bodhicitta, this idea of wanting to develop ourselves completely, to become a Buddha so we can benefit other sentient beings. So let's recite this together with those thoughts in mind. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe soknam gi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, thank you, Shayla. Um, so again, welcome everyone to this new class that we're doing for 5 Sundays in total. I'll talk about the schedule in a moment, but this is a class that's called Heart Advice for Death and Dying. I think it was developed by our organization back in 2008. So it's been around for a while, almost 20 years. And it's a really wonderful course to kind of get us into talking about death, working with death in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in particular. So again, there'll be lots of teachings that are part of this, but also it's meant to be really an exploration for yourself to get more in touch with your own mortality. And of course, the implications of that, what we need to do with this life to make sure that when death approaches, we're prepared, what have you. So again, I think this will be a wonderful course for all of you. Those of you who've been around Buddhism for a while may learn a few new things. Those of you who are new to Buddhism will hopefully gain some appreciation, especially again for the Tibetan Buddhist approach to looking at the issue of death and dying. So I want to just talk a little bit about the schedule. We do have a kind of break in the schedule in 2 weeks, but I certainly don't want you to not come. On that Sunday, we're going to do something special. You do have a link to all of these documents in the on the website for this course. So if you go into our website and click on that page for this course, you will have a link that will take you to a Google Drive where I posted all these documents. There I have a little quote from the Buddha around impermanence and things changing constantly, something we're going to talk about a little bit today. Today's session, we're going to do a few things, kind of approach the topic of death, do a little bit of an exploration ourselves in terms of our own ideas around death and anticipation of death and what have you. Talk a little bit about death and rebirth in Buddhism, how it's presented, what the teachings are that give us the foundation for everything else we're going to explore in this course. And then begin what's called the death awareness meditation. It's a process of kind of examining 3 issues in regard to death that we'll go into that again a little bit later today. Next Sunday, we'll continue the work with that death awareness meditation with the second of the 3 main topics. Look a little bit about how we work with our disturbing emotions that can be problematic, particularly at the time of death, and how we make sure that we do what we can to sort of purify and remove anything that might be obstacles to our well-being as we go from this life to our next life. The Sakadawa Duchen is one of the most powerful days, if not the most powerful day in the Buddhist calendar. It's a day that kind of signifies the birth, the enlightenment, and the passing away of the Buddha. So 3 main life events in the life of the Buddha. And so that day is a very auspicious day. So May 31st, 2 weeks from today, I'll be leading a special practice that day that's part of a project that's going on right now. Today was the start of that. Today is the official month of Sakadawa. The first 2 weeks as the moon is waxing are very powerful times for practice. But we're going to be engaging in this practice of working with Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, and reciting his mantra from now until November 1st. On November 1st, the entire count of all of these mantras will be offered to His Holiness the Dalai Lama as kind of a way to create the causes for his good health and long life and so on. So please come to that practice session. That'll be taking place at the same time from 10 to 11:30. I'll talk a little bit more about it maybe next week. If you do have a mala, a Buddhist rosary, it would be good to bring that so you can count the mantras that you're going to recite, because again, we're going to offer the count to His Holiness. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe at the end of next week as a preview to what we're going to do on the 31st. We'll pick back up the course in June with the first 3 Sundays in June, talking about, how we prepare for death in terms of what will be most useful at the time of death, what we do in terms of spiritual preparation for death. These are the sorts of topics we'll be dealing with in session 3. Session 4 gives us the Tibetan Buddhist teachings on what actually happens at death. Really quite intriguing and interesting teachings if you haven't encountered them before. The stages of the death process and what occurs in the mind as the layers of consciousness sort of fall away and we get into deeper and subtler states of awareness. And then what happens from the point of view of Tibetan Buddhism and other Eastern traditions that talk about rebirth. The process of what happens to the mind as we go from this life into our next existence. And I'll touch on that a little bit today in terms of those of you who might be new to that concept, to kind of have some appreciation for what Buddhism teaches about that. The final class, we'll talk a bit more about spiritual support for those who are dying and the deceased. A little bit of a practice that is wonderful in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition, taking and giving Tonglen, and then also even some practical considerations to prepare for death. We have kind of a tendency, as we're going to talk about a little bit today, to put death off and think it's way in the future and not necessarily even make practical considerations and, take into account what we need to do to prepare for death in that regard. So that's the agenda of what we're going to cover over these 5 Sundays. And then after that, we're going to go on to a new course that I'll be here for, on the 37 practices of Bodhisattvas. So I hope you can join for that as well. I want to mention that this is a course. Let me take it off screen for just a moment. This is a course that is offered by our organization for a certificate if you're interested in that. I don't know if people necessarily are. If you are interested, then you, of course, need to do the meditations and some of the readings. I'm going to introduce you to the reading list. There's one main book that you can obtain online. And if you want to do that, you're welcome to kind of follow along with some of the readings that support what I'm doing in the teachings. This main book is called Heart Advice for Death and Dying. It's this book like this, but again, I don't think it's available in hard form unless we have any around here. I don't know. Maybe in the library, I'm not sure, but yeah. But essentially, yeah, this is available as a PDF file and maybe even as like one of the ebook versions, but essentially you can follow along if you'd like. And so again, I've assigned the reading for each of these weeks, so you can split up the reading over the course of the entire course. I've given the numbers of the meditations that we're going to do that I'm going to be assigning. And in the course, in the class, I will be touching on these meditations, so you'll have an idea of how to go about doing them. It's a written meditation, as usual, that you can just use on your own to investigate these topics separately. So again, this is a kind of just a little outline of kind of how I've split up that material and meditations. I might mention that again, as part of what I've loaded over on the Google Drive, there are some books that were advised when this course was put together. That first one on the list there, maybe you can make it a little bit larger, Mind of Clear Light. This is a wonderful book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It covers a lot more on the stages of death than what I'm going to be able to talk about, and is really quite a nice book. So that's one of them I would definitely recommend of what's on the list here. But there are obviously many different books in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in particular that deal with death and dying. If you're new to meditation, there are some books on meditation, and I do have one handout on meditation posture, which I won't talk about so much, but you're welcome to take a look at that. A little bit about caring for the dying. We all might end up in that role if we haven't already in this life of caring for parents or loved ones, even for our pets as they're going through the death process. And it's good to have some kind of awareness of how best to care, especially for the folks in our lives who are close to us. I've put together a supplemental reading list that includes, again, the book Heart Advice for Death and Dying. That again, it mentions their FPMT. I should have put the link in there. I'll go home and correct this and correct the file. It is available again at the FPMT's website, our little sort of online store where we have online materials available. There's also an accompanying book of practices, which I'll talk about later in the course. Not so necessary at this point to go into that. And then there's a wonderful book that was published that's based on this little book that was originally published. Many of you have this copy, How to Enjoy Death. This was Lama Zopa Rinpoche's little guide for how to approach death in our tradition and so on. It's a wonderful book for those of you who are more involved around this process. I loved how it was put together like a Bible. I had this vision of like putting them in all the hotels in Santa Fe, right next to the Gideon Bible. And so people would come in and they go, should I read How to Enjoy Death or should I read the Bible? But anyway, it's been republished as a book that is also available. I do have the link there for that one. It's a free PDF file that you can download if you're interested in getting more details on how to approach this topic. And this may become more relevant after the course, after I've gone through a number of the things that are involved in, again, the Tibetan Buddhist view of death and dying. I've added my own list of additional books, some of which come from other traditions. And some of these I'll be touching on here and there that I find really quite useful. Again, we all have to deal with the reality of death, so there's a lot of different ways of approaching it. But different Buddhist traditions have different ways of talking about death and dying, and I think it's useful to have some of that. One is on the list there. The top one is by our dear Joan Halifax Roshi at Upaya Zen Center, a book that she wrote that's based on the program they do there called Being with Dying. And then about 4 titles down there is Living in the Light of Death, which I'll actually refer to a little bit later today. Larry Rosenberg, who's involved with the Insight Meditation Society. So there's a lot of, again, books out there. I've added a few more around caring for the dying that I've found really useful in the work that I've done around being with people who are dying. I've also added a few things around bereavement, grief, loss, how we deal with that. Burial options even, which is something I'll touch on later in this course, and then other practical considerations that we might need to take into account in regard to our death. So I'm giving you, again, just an overview of all of that so you have some idea about these materials that are available out there. So what I want to talk about today, this very first topic, is, again, kind of approaching the topic of death. And we always say this frequently, in our culture, that we've gotten to where death is not something we talk about so easily. If we go back even 100 years in this country, people were having people dying in their own homes, right? You would be born in that home, live in that home, and die in that home. And people would be around and be dealing with the reality of death in a much more present and direct way than what we do in our culture now. We've gotten to where often when people are, in older years, then they're put off into homes where they're taken care of until their death. We're not even that intimately involved often with the care for another person who is dying. So we obviously are in a place in our culture where death is not a topic that we approach so easily. The tendency that we have, and let me go ahead and start a little slideshow that I have here that's just going to be some bullet points mainly around what I'm sharing as I go through this. We tend to have kind of 2 different attitudes towards death. The common attitudes that we have, first of all, having a kind of extreme fear of death so that we put it completely out of our mind, right? A lot of people don't even want to talk about death, don't want to hear about death. They don't even necessarily want to go to a funeral. They want to have kind of this detachment from it. which of course isn't a productive way of dealing with the reality of death. Death is something, as we're going to be exploring in today's class, that happens to all of us without exception. So we have to kind of bring that into our awareness and not have this extreme fear. There is a wholesome fear that we can have around death. That is something we'll be touching on. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, one of his earlier books on death and dying, was called Wholesome Fear. In Buddhism, we often deal with this idea of some of what we might have some trepidation or fear of is actually good to have fear of, so that we are doing what we need to do to be ready for that. And this is one of the case certainly with death, is if we can have a sort of wholesome sense of fear, some sort of respect for that reality that's going to happen, so that we then do what's necessary to be prepared when that moment comes. The other common attitude that we have about it, perhaps, is people being somewhat careless and flippant about death, thinking, oh, well, I don't need to deal with death. It's something that's going to happen in the future, and I'll deal with it when it comes. Maybe we deal with a lot of things in our life when they come, but death is a pretty important moment in terms of our spiritual path in particular. And if we understand, again, the Tibetan Buddhist structure for how we go on from this life to another existence, it is the sort of porthole, the doorway through which we move into our next existence. So it has a great ramification in our lives. So being somewhat aloof about death and thinking, oh, I'm going to deal with it when it comes, well, you may be prepared when it comes. And then again, it may be worthwhile for you to do some preparation now, and even every day of this life, so that whenever death does come, which is the topic we're going to look at next week, how it's uncertain when death actually does arrive, we'll be ready for it. We'll actually be prepared. We'll say, oh, now's the time. I've been preparing for this every day of my life, and now it's actually here. Now I feel fully prepared. So neither of these attitudes, being excessively fearful nor having a kind of careless attitude about death, are really that productive. And that's the problem with those. To kind of get ourselves into understanding about death, we have to be willing to take a look at it more seriously. I put on the table there, and maybe we'll take just a moment to pass around. I don't know if you don't have a piece of paper, there's some index cards over there, a little bit larger index cards. You can grab one or two of those. We're going to do a little writing exercise, kind of a little exploration on our own around death and dying. There's also some pens there that you're welcome to help yourself to during the exercise. You can just leave anything when you leave there on the table. But if we could maybe just go ahead, if people want to pass those around or take some of the pens and just, pass them. So, those of you who are online, take a moment to find a piece of paper, pad, or whatever, with some pencil, writing utensil, whatever. And if you want to write on your computer, you're certainly welcome to do that. You can just pull up, a Word file or whatever and write. You don't have to necessarily do it on paper. But again, we're going to do this little exercise, and to kind of get us into the space for doing this to some degree, I'm going to read a little passage from Joan Halifax Roshi's book. I mentioned this book just a short while ago, called Being with Dying. And in the beginning, she talks about how they start their workshops around death and dying. And I really like this. So I'm going to do that in a moment. But she begins this whole thing by talking about how a few years ago, oh, we'll wait till everyone's got the paper passed around. Otherwise, that's okay. I'll read this in just a moment. Again, does anyone still need some paper and pen? And everyone online hopefully is kind of prepared. You don't necessarily have to write everything out, but I think it's useful. Kind of gives you something that you can take a look at and think about. And after this, we're going to break into dyads and pairs and talk about it a little bit, just do a little bit of processing on it. But okay, so she has this passage at the very beginning when she talks about this exercise we're going to do called How Do You Want to Die? She says, a few years ago, a dying friend read me some lines from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. They made me smile. Virtuous King Yudhishthira, he's the son of Yama, the Lord of Death, and the kind of the myth of death in the Hindu tradition. Yama is the Lord of Death, and we often talk about that even in Tibetan Buddhism, but it's not really a being. It's just personification of death. Anyway, this King Yudhishthira is asked, what is the most wondrous thing in the world? And Yudhisthira replies, the most wondrous thing in the world is that all around us, people can be dying, and we don't believe it can happen to us. And this is kind of the starting point for this exercise. And what I want you to do, again, it might take a moment to think about what these questions. You don't have to do it right away. You don't have to immediately start writing. But I'm going to kind of give you two questions and then a third that's sort of a follow-up that you can write about if you wish. But the very first one might be a little difficult. And if this is too difficult for you to do, you're welcome to not do it. I'm just encouraging you to explore this idea because it is useful for us to think about our own death. First, write down your thoughts on the following. What is your worst case scenario of how you will die? When you think about your death that's in the future sometime, what would be the worst case for that happening? And be as specific as possible. If you can, how, when, of what, with whom, where. And you don't have to, again, get really down in the grass, but, some idea of what would be this worst case scenario. What does it look like? Having written down that answer, kind of ask yourself how you feel, how your body feels, what is coming up for you. So maybe just take a moment just to think about this if you need to. And then when you're ready, you can begin writing. Again, what does your worst case scenario look like? And I'll give you a few minutes for this. So again, try to come up with something that is your worst case scenario. And be sure also you can write down if you wish, how you feel thinking about that possibility of this worst case scenario. What your body feels like, what's coming up for you in your mind. What sorts of emotions are you having? Just about another half minute or so, and we'll go on to the second question. Okay, the second question might be more of your liking. How do you really want to die? Again, as with the first question, be as specific as possible. When, where, of what, who's with you, kind of that idea. And then again, after having answered that question, ask yourself what's happening in your body, in your mind, emotionally, physically. How do you really want to die? What does your ideal death look like? And take about another 30 seconds or so. Wrap up your answer and your reflections on how you feel answering that question. Then we have, again, a final question that you're welcome to write a few comments down, but this is more just a sort of reflection. What are you willing to do to die the way you want to die? To what extent are you ready to invest in time, energy, to create the sort of death that you would like to have? Not that we have complete control over that scenario, but what do we do now to invest in that? Are you willing to do that? What are you willing to do? And just take another 30 seconds or so to write down any thoughts on that or reflect on that. Okay. So what I'd like to do, I know it might get a little noisy in the room here, but I don't want people to wander too far. We're going to take 10 minutes for you to pair up with somebody. Maybe it's somebody who you don't know, who you can kind of get to know, create more of that community feel that we always try to do here at the Buddha Center. And you can, if you want to, you can wander out a little bit, but don't go too far. I'll ring the bell when it's time for everyone to come back in, but take 5 minutes each to talk about what this was like. And if you'd like to share what you wrote down, you're more than welcome to do that. If it's something you don't feel comfortable sharing, you don't need to do that. But just talk a little bit about what this process was like for you in terms of what came up for you, looking at the possibility of a worst case scenario, what an ideal death might look like, what you might mean to prepare for that. Is everyone clear? Just spend a little time talking about it. And if those aren't resonating for you, you can just talk about whatever. But I'd like to keep the topic around death and dying and spending a little time around that. So we'll begin here on my computer. It says 10:40 in Mountain Time. So we'll reconvene at 10:50. So again, take 10 minutes, 5 minutes each, and I'll ring the bell in 10 minutes. Okay? All right. Are there any comments that anyone wants to share on doing that exercise, especially those online didn't have a chance to discuss it with anybody? Anything that you wanted to share from looking at that worst case scenario as well as a more ideal way that you would like your death to proceed? Anyone? Yes, please. Let's get the microphone. Who has the microphone now? I don't know where the microphone is, just so folks can hear you online. And yeah, if you want to share online, please just put your raise hand signal up. Please.
Name is Tyler.
Hey, Tyler.
I'll answer my first worst case scenario, and I wrote that crucifixion would probably be the worst. Speaking truth and being publicly humiliated and then murdered at home or on TV would be how I felt about it was mixed because it sounds torturous, but also at the end very liberating. To answer my second question, how do I really want to die? I wrote in the process of doing something that I love doing with the folks that I love and in celebration. How I feel about that is that that day I feel loved and I relish the day. I look forward to it. My third one, is there anything that I'm doing to prepare? And I wrote, I do not do. I will just be. And so I'm looking forward to surrendering to that and journeying on. So for me, I believe that it's not a misfortune. And so I do practice death meditations. And I've accepted that if death is here for me, I'm ready for it. I'm not going to run. And I've also found that, folks who are like that, if you speak that way, it's almost illegal to speak that way. And so, and I've also learned that folks who don't speak that way, they go through with it. And so, if you have someone who says those sort of things, they're crying for help and they want you to stop them. And it's important. So, yeah, so that's just what I wanted to share. So thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Tyler. Appreciate that. Anyone else want to just share again what this was like going through this exercise or anything you feel you need? Let's go to June and then to Delhi. And then again, anyone online? Oh, I'm sorry, we do have Danny. We'll come to Danny after June. Go ahead, June.
Um, I thought this was wonderful. I usually don't like to share, but this was really great. And I enjoyed meeting Tyler and getting to know him a little bit better. My worst scenario would be to die in a car accident or some other kind of quick accident kind of thing, or even die in my sleep. I would feel nothing and not be aware of it. And the way I would like to die would be in awareness with a feeling of calm. I've known since I was about 8 years old that things die. My father told me And I think he didn't want to scare me to death. He said, you probably will have a nice long life. But everything that is born dies. I think it was when my cat died or something like that. I would like to be with just a few people that I really care about and love. Or even alone, so that I could go through the whole process with awareness. And I don't know. At this point, I don't know how I'll feel on my deathbed. I have no idea. But I'd like for it to have a little bit of a feeling of an adventure. You know, that I don't know exactly where I'm going right at this minute, but I think that I'm doing right now what I need to do to die in that way. I really want to know what's going on.
Good. Good. Thanks for sharing that, June.
That's it.
Let's go to Danny online. Thanks, June. Yes, if you can unmute, Danny. Oh, you're still muted. Yeah. Let's see if I do an ask to unmute, maybe that'll.
There it goes.
There we go.
Yeah, saying the host is not on. I have an echo. Okay, it reminds me that I need to practice more not being afraid, and so that I can cope with any situation, because I know that the calm, the love, and the lack of fear are the key elements no matter what. During the POA class I took during the pandemic, I wasn't able to open the channel up here to put the little fuchsia grass in. And he said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. What matters is how you're going to accept it at the time. And that really stuck with me, to not have the fear, because my worst fear is being in a hospital. I hate Western medicine, but I need to stop hating that and practice on accepting anything. It's great. Thank you, Don, for having this. And
Yeah. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it. Good to see you again. And then Deli, please. And then we won't be able to share too much.
That's very short remark, because I know I have a friend, and she told me once that she died already once. It was like for several minutes in a hospital. And then when he came back, she found out that she lost fear of death completely. She'd been there. She knows that. And she doesn't afraid.
Right.
It's interesting perspective.
Yeah. They call these near-death experiences, but it is actually, some level of a death experience that they go through. And oftentimes that's the case. People come back with kind of a renewed interest in life and very little fear of death. So, yeah. Maybe if there's time for one more comment, anyone else online or in the Gompa here? Oh, just behind where Deli was. What's your name, by the way?
My name is Lisa Freeman.
Good to meet you, Lisa.
And my worst case scenario is being in a care facility and not having, present time awareness or consciousness, and not being able to be independent or to control my body functions. So I don't want that level of helplessness or unconsciousness. And I would like to die very consciously and with my faculties intact in a loving and positive environment.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. So again, it's not that we all have a similar concept then of what a worst case or a best case scenario is. When you were talking, June, it was interesting. My mother always wanted to die in her sleep. She wanted to die just going out with no awareness. Of course, she had a different view of what was going to happen on the other side of death than what we hold in Buddhism. But nonetheless, I think, again, we can see that there are some things that definitely are in that category of maybe not ideal ways to die because of the disturbance to our minds. We'll talk about that again as we go through this course, how having some measure of control over our minds as we go into the death process is really an important part of what we're trying to do here. That final question of kind of what are you willing to do to be prepared to have the death that you'd like, is a lot of it is working with our own minds in terms of what Buddhism offers, an ability to come into the death process with very little fear, and you don't have to go through a near-death experience in order to have that, but to be able to have the confidence that you're fully prepared. In fact, we can say that the work that we're doing here is to help us to do two things. First of all, to make good use of the time that we have, because every day of our lives we can do something meaningful and purposeful with that. And secondly, to do what we can to feel prepared for death, so that when death comes, however it looks, it might be our worst case scenario, hopefully not, but it could be that more ideal death, and we are ready for that process to unfold and to actually move into that again with greater peace of mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about kind of the approach to, and thank you all for engaging in that exercise. I know it's not easy looking at the first question in particular. I had my previous answers to it that I'd done the last time I led this course, and they aren't really that different. Mine too has to do with kind of a very violent death. I seem to have this recurring dream of like meeting somebody in a dark alley. I can't tell who it is, and they pull a gun on me or a knife, and that type of like a violent dying, bleeding out in a street, with nobody around, that sort of thing is really my kind of nightmare death. And then my more ideal one is really based on what we're going to be going through in this course. How do we actually die more at peace in a more gradual way where we can have the awareness and an ability to see what is happening? So I want to talk about death and rebirth in Buddhism. There may be, again, some of you who are not as familiar with some of these concepts. Many of you come every Sunday, and so you probably have heard some of these things before. But first of all, of course, we can all say, and certainly Buddhism is not unique in saying this, that it's a natural and an inevitable part of life. If you don't want to die, don't get born, essentially. Being born means you're going to die. It's a reality that we all have to face. It's embedded in Buddhist teachings, particularly around the subject of impermanence. We often put these two together, impermanence and death. But death is really at the level of what we call gross impermanence. I want to just talk a little bit about subtle impermanence and introduce you to the handout that we have on that. That is a little meditation that you can do. I'll show that in a moment. This concept of impermanence in Buddhism, impermanence, sometimes in our culture, we think impermanent means it doesn't last, and permanent means it does last. That's not the way we're looking at these concepts in Buddhism. Impermanence means it doesn't last for a moment. In other words, everything is changing. There's a kind of a subtle process of changing that's going on, and then there's, of course, the grosser levels of change that happen. Death falls into the latter category, but it's a product of the first level of impermanence, the subtle impermanence that is happening all the time. I mean, if we look at these bodies that we have, for example, and that's part of the meditation, you actually start with examining your body, then you examine your mind, and then you examine the physical world around you. And all of these things are constantly changing. We don't have that perception most of the time, though, right? We think that things are a bit static and not, so dynamically moving forward and changing and transforming and what have you. But our bodies, I remember hearing the statistic many years ago, over the course of 7 years, every single cell in your body has been completely replaced by a new cell, some of them more rapidly than others, but over the course of 7 years, every single cell is a different one than what you had 7 years ago. So that's showing just again that there is a process that we undergo that it's not really visible to us. It's not something that we really notice. We notice grosser changes, right? When we look and we go, oh, what's going on with my face? What are all those wrinkles doing there? What's happening in terms of, my complexion, whatever. But gross impermanence, the gross impermanence of death is the one that hits us the most because it is, again, the end of this life. Throughout this life, everything is constantly changing. And if we had more acceptance of that reality, we would be not so averse to the subtle things that are happening in our lives. But of course, in terms of gross impermanence, if we have the awareness of death and that is a reality for all of us, then we're much better kind of open to what is going to happen at death and how we can, again, prepare for that reality. So this is the context for how we look at death in Buddhism, is that it's part of the natural state of things being impermanent. Everything that arises from causes and conditions changes moment by moment. The Buddha does say there are some phenomena that are permanent, meaning that they are unchanging. They don't change from moment to moment. But we don't normally talk about those things, in terms of what we deal with in our everyday life is the impermanent, is the fact that everything is changing moment by moment and that most things do go out of existence. Well, one of the things that doesn't go out of existence, but certainly changes moment by moment, is our minds. Death in Buddhism is referring specifically to the reality of our mind separating from the body. So this may be a new concept to some of you, but when we talk about mind in Buddhism, we're talking about it in terms of how we look at this phenomenon that is this constant arising of a sort of stream of awareness, a stream of experience. We often define mind as having the nature of clarity, meaning that it is not something material. You can't point to the mind. Mind doesn't have color or shape or any of these other physical characteristics. And mind has the function of knowing, of helping us to be aware of the world that we're in. Mind in Buddhism is not equivalent to the body. There is an interrelationship between these two, particularly in this human existence, where we have a very complex nervous system. We have the brain and the whole central nervous system that goes into all the various parts of our body that can have tactile sensations, and our eyes that can see, and our nose that can smell, and ears can hear, and tongue can taste. All of these things are physical kind of connections that we have to this body. But the mind itself, the realm of that experience, is not physical. Now, in science, of course, they're still struggling with what is consciousness. In fact, I just picked up a book not that long ago. God, I can't remember the man's name ever. He's the one who wrote recently on the use of hallucinogenics and how to change your mind. Michael Pollan, yes. So he wrote this new book that's kind of talking about theories around consciousness. What is consciousness? Of course, the more classic one that has merged out of recent kind of scientific study is a materialist view. A materialist view says that essentially consciousness or awareness is what's happening when all this electrochemical stuff is going on in our brains. And when that ceases at death, then consciousness ceases. Well, that's a materialist view, and it's not what Buddhism holds. Yes, Lisa. Yes. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out, Lisa. Essentially, consciousness, mind, awareness, I'm going to use those as syllogisms or synonyms. They're synonyms in a very loose way in our Western language, but in Buddhism, we talk about those very often as just being equivalent. So consciousness, mind, awareness, again, is this stream of moments. It has no physicality. It is a changing phenomenon, just like our bodies and so on, but it has its own way of arising from prior moments of mind. In Buddhism, there isn't a materialistic view in the sense that when all of this physical stuff stops, that mind ceases. Mind keeps giving rise to future moments of mind. Mind gives rise to future moments of mind that are outside of this existence, that are in what we call the intermediate state between this existence and our next one, and then our next existence. And then, of course, that happens again. We have an end to that existence. We go on to some intermediate state, and we go on to another existence. This is what's called the process of rebirth. It's all based on the nature of mind. If we don't start with that fundamental premise that this is what mind is, it gets to be very hard to talk about, death or any of these things in Buddhism, because the sort of caveat is that this is what we're starting with, is that mind has continuity, that our minds do not cease at the end of this life, and that we therefore have to be somewhat concerned about what unfolds for the mind and for our being, in a sense then, as death occurs, as we go on to our next existence and so on. Now, of course, what's shaping this whole process is actually the mind itself. You know, in Buddhism, we often use this term karma as well, and I'm going to introduce you to it in a very brief way. We'll talk about it here and there throughout this course, but it's a very important concept in Buddhism because karma is essentially the movement of our minds. And of course, our bodies and speech that follow from those movements of our minds. But karma is this force, this energy that we are creating constantly through our minds, through our volitional thoughts, the things that we decide to think about, as well as those more habitual things that just take over and that cause us to have certain mental kind of emotions and things like that. But essentially, this is the mechanism by which we have the unfolding of our experiences throughout this life, as well as throughout future existences. Karma and rebirth are very much interconnected. You know, we create the karma for our experiences that we are going through right now, and how we deal with those experiences creates the karma for our future experiences. It's all a very dynamic process. It's not something that's kind of that linear, even though we tend to think of it in linear terms. It actually is something we have many dimensions to. We're going to talk again a bit more about karma as we get into this course. But essentially, when we talk about death as a particular moment of time, we're talking about the fact that our minds have been together with this body in this symbiotic relationship. And at the time of death, our consciousness is actually going to separate from this body. And it is going to go on to have another existence. And of course, it'll be another person then. It's the same continuity of awareness, this sort of singular thread of awareness that goes through all of our existences, all of our rebirths. But it will have a new identity. It'll be a new person, a new being, and a new existence that will have all of its various defining features, again, based on the karma that you've created, based on what actions you have done that influence that. So death becomes a very important moment in terms of our lives and getting to the end of our lives and moving to our next one, because oftentimes they say that the state of our minds at death is one of the most crucial factors for determining what happens after this life. It also matters, of course, what we do with our lives right now, the sorts of karmas that we create. But the mind at the time of death is extremely important in terms of helping us to have the experience that we want to going from this life and into the next existence, kind of shaping that. So in Buddhism, though, this is a conditioning that we have right now. This is what we often call samsara. I know this word samsara, they actually use it it's a trademark of a perfume, which is kind of strange. I think it was Venerable Tenzin Palmo, she says, samsara is kind of like that. It sort of smells nice, but it really isn't. Anyway, samsara, this state of existence we're in now, where the mind is conditioned through our karma and through the states of mind that cause us to create karma, to keep going from life to life. We often refer to this as cyclic existence. We just keep getting recycled into another existence, another existence. It is possible to become free of that cycle of death and rebirth. And of course, to attain what we call in Buddhism the state of nirvana. Not the band Nirvana. This is a state where you have kind of, again, the peace, the freedom from all those factors that have kept you bound up in this cycle of existence. You can even go beyond that to attain what we had the motivation of earlier today, a state of enlightenment, Buddhahood, a state where you are then free, not only of your own stuff, but you're in a perfect position to help others with theirs, to kind of be a force of good in the world, to help beings to find their true potential and to be free from the round of existence and moreover attain that same state of Buddhahood. So again, I highlighted this a little while ago. It's important then to accept and be aware of death for these two reasons. I'll reiterate them because they're very important. They're sort of the real impetus of why we hold a course like this. First of all, we will be more likely to use this life wisely. Even what Deli was sharing in terms of that experience of her friend coming back from this near-death experience, kind of informed her life, I'm sure. Made her a bit more aware of knowing the reality of death there, knowing it a bit more intimately through that experience, of understanding kind of the preciousness of this life, the importance of this life. We'll go into that as we go through this course as well. How do we use this life in the most productive and beneficial way? And then the second point, we will put energy into doing what will enable us to be prepared for death. As I said, the time of death is a very crucial one, and the state of mind that we have is a big factor in determining what happens after our death. That's why, again, when we talk about these worst case scenarios, one of the worst cases in Buddhist terms is when we die with a mind that is extremely agitated. If we die with a mind of anger, I remember hearing my first incident where I heard about what they have come to call road rage, right? Road rage didn't exist forever. Of course, we didn't have vehicles on the road, a long time ago. But the idea is road rage is, a very horrible way to die. And I heard of this was when I was living in San Francisco, down the peninsula. There was an incident where at a 7-Eleven convenience store, two people were aiming for the same parking spot. One got in before the other, and the other one thought it was their spot, right? And they got into an argument over this. And one of these two gentlemen had a gun in their glove compartment, took their gun out and shot the other person. Imagine dying with your mind that agitated, again, over something as trivial as a parking spot. It's not something that matters in the end that greatly. You get to the end of your life and go, I really should have had that parking spot. That parking spot was mine. You usually let it go shortly after, right? If somebody does this to you, you go, oh, well, I'm annoyed. They took my spot. But you go find another spot and it's probably out of your mind in a few hours, right? But this person held on to it. They died with this mind of horrible anger, just clenching that anger. So again, this is something to keep in mind, is that we want to be prepared for death. We want to be able to die with our minds as peaceful as possible. Again, and whatever will support that. It might be people around us who support it. We're going to look at some of those factors later in this course. What will be the ideal things to help us to die with a very peaceful mind? Because we're running out of time, I want to introduce you at least to again, I will show the two meditations in a moment. Let me talk a little bit about the last thing I want to cover today. I'm not going to be able to do justice to this completely, but you do have the meditation that you can look through. This is the beginning of what's called the 9-point death awareness meditation. 9-point death awareness meditation is divided into 3 groups of 3. The 3 main points that we're going to look at, the one we're going to start with today, is called the inevitability of death, the fact that death is certain and inevitable for every one of us. Now, you may wonder, if we asked anyone on the street, are you going to die? They would say, well, of course I'm going to die. Everybody dies. What's the difference between doing this meditation and just those sort of, cursory answers of, yes, I'm going to die? The difference is that we're going to really look at what effect does that reality of our death, the certainty of our death, have on how we live our lives? Because if we hold that awareness every day, that death is a reality, we'll probably make different choices about what we do with this life. That's the beginning of this unfolding of the death awareness meditation. Let me give you kind of a brief introduction to the 2 other points that are kind of the root propositions or root thoughts that we want to have around death in this 9-point awareness. Let me not talk about that so much. 9-point death meditation on death. These are the 3 we're going to be looking at today. Death is inevitable. It is certain that you will die, in other words. Secondly, the time of death is uncertain. Okay? The time that death will come for us, we do not know. And it could happen, in fact, at any moment. I hope all of you are back next Sunday and that you haven't died. But the reality is we could die between now and next Sunday. We could die between now and getting home. We could die between now and going to sleep tonight. We could die between now and tomorrow morning. There's no guarantees on this. This is a really important topic we're going to look at next week. The third one is, of course, what is helpful, given that this is what death is and what will be happening, what is helpful at the time of death? We'll look at the things that we tend to rely upon in our lives and come to see that at death, they're not really so reliable. Well, what can we rely upon? What is it that will actually give us some support at the time of death? These are what we're going to be looking at in these first 3 sessions. What's a very classic meditation on death that comes from the Indian Buddhist tradition. So this first root, death is inevitable. As I said, we need to meditate on this because we have that awareness, but we don't live our lives with that awareness. We don't actually think about, death every day and the reality of that, and then make decisions on the basis of that. Let's take a look at each of the 3 points underneath this. This is, again, why it's called a 9-point death awareness meditation. We have 3 points or reasons that we examine underneath each of these three main topics. The first one, again, today, death is inevitable. We look first of all at the reality that everyone has to die. Now, how you're encouraged to do that is to really look at this kind of the fact that anyone that we can think about from history has had to go through the death process. I mean, even Jesus Christ died, even the Buddha died. All these great figures of the past that were spiritual leaders, that were political leaders, all the great artists and writers and everything of all time have all had to die. But they encourage you also to bring it into your own experience. I mean, look at the people we've known in our own lives who have died. Every one of you, I'm sure, has people that you know who have died, relatives that have died, friends that have died. And we had a kid who died in our high school, like electrocuted during the summer break, right? This can happen. This is a reality that we all have to face. It can happen to all of those that we know. And of course, it can happen to ourselves. We have to kind of bring it in from a general awareness of death to this fact that everyone dies, therefore I die. My death is a certainty. One way of gaining an appreciation for this, I mentioned this book earlier that's from Larry Rosenberg, Living in the Light of Death. You can make this into something that you do even while you're watching entertainment. He used the example of films from the 30s. Of course, some of us, remember some of those films we might have seen. Some of you may be interested in those kinds of films. But he says sometimes methods just suggest themselves. One night some years ago, I had given a talk on death awareness. So it was on my mind afterward when I went up to my apartment to unwind. I love movies, especially old movies. That night, there was a film from 1938 with Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. Some of you probably never heard of Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. And as a film buff, I had heard of everyone who was involved, the writer, the director, the producer. Suddenly, I realized that everyone connected to that movie was dead, right? Nobody was alive, right? He says, there they were bounding around in the prime of life, wonderfully virile and sensual and attractive, and all of them were dead. The person who got the idea, the person who fleshed it out and wrote the screenplay, the person who wrote the score, everyone who played in the orchestra, probably even the people who sold the popcorn in the theaters were dead. It was stunning to realize the movie was so alive and they were so dead. So again, you can use this as something that you don't just do on the cushion. I'm going to share occasionally these sorts of examples of ways you can bring that awareness into your everyday life. As we, kind of partake of these teachings, try to find ways to bring that mindfulness of death into your everyday life. But this first point is coming to that conclusion that there is nobody who's escaped death. I think that was even the title of a book about Jim Morrison's life, right? Nobody gets out of here alive. No one gets out of here alive. Everyone has death at the end of their life, right? Okay. Let me go ahead and share the second point, which is your lifespan is decreasing continuously. This is an interesting one because this one really tends to hit home, at least when I meditate on it. The fact that every single second we are closer to our death, whenever it's going to happen. If it happens tomorrow, well, obviously we're getting closer to tomorrow. But if it happens even 50 years from now, 20 years from now, 10 years from now, we're also getting closer to that date. Sometimes the analogy is used of like an hourglass. When we're born, it's like the hourglass is turned over, and there's so many grains of sand that we have that are sort of constituting this life. One grain going through every moment of this life, right? Well, we don't know how many grains are in the top, but the reality is that with every single grain that goes through that hole into the bottom chamber, we have one less grain of sand to experience, one less moment of this life. Lama Zopa Rinpoche recommends just watching a clock for a while. Meditate on a clock and how that, second hand keeps going around. Nowadays, of course, we have digital clocks and what have you. You can also, Larry Rosenberg mentions using the breath. With every breath, we have one less breath in this life. We don't know how many breaths we have. We have millions of breaths in this life. There's billions of breaths, zillions of breaths in this life. But with every breath, we are one breath closer to death. You can use whatever analogy you want. And there's some that are suggested in the meditation. But the idea is that this is a continuum we are on. We're like on a conveyor belt, getting closer and closer to the end of the belt, right? It's not something that we can stop. You can't just take a break. You can't plug your finger into the hole of the hourglass and say, okay, no more grains of sand for a while. I'm tired of this all moving towards death. It's always just going to keep going through. The last one isn't really a reason for why death is inevitable, but it's pointing to the fact that the amount of time that we actually have in any particular day for spiritual practice is actually quite small. Now, what do we mean by spiritual practice? I mean, there are a lot of people that engage in, meditation and maybe recitation of various things, or, certain practices. Many of you might have tantric practices that you do. Those are all part of spiritual practice. But what's at the real heart of spiritual practice? Changing our minds. To what degree in any day do we dedicate time to looking at our minds, changing our minds, being aware of our thoughts, trying to reduce the negative tendencies, trying to develop the more positive qualities? That's what we mean by spiritual practice. To what degree are we conscious and aware of that? You can do that as you do your work, as you do various things. But for most of us, we get caught up in a lot of sort of mundane and trivial activities throughout our day, doing all these things without much awareness of how we're working with our minds during those. So when it comes down to it, how much time do you really dedicate to working on your mind? Maybe your only time that you're looking at your mind is when you're on your cushion, when you're actually doing your meditation. And what portion of your day is doing that? Maybe 20, 30 minutes of a day, an hour of a day. Even if it's 3 hours of a day, it's still not that much time. So when it comes down to it, the amount of time we have to devote to spiritual practice is really quite limited in any particular 24-hour period. Therefore, we have to kind of do what we can now, because death is inevitable, and death will come whether we've practiced or not. I think that's actually the way that Joan Halifax Roshi talks about this point in her teaching. She says, death will come whether you've made time for practice or not. Whether you've worked with your mind or not, death is a reality and will come when it's ripe for death to happen, right? So this is kind of the gist of this meditation that I'm going to encourage you to take a look at and work with. And we'll talk about it a little bit more at the beginning, and maybe I'll even lead a little meditation on it at the beginning. The conclusion you come to through having meditated on those 3 points, that everyone has to die, that I'm growing closer to death every moment, that the amount of time that I have for spiritual practice is actually quite limited, is I am definitely going to die. Therefore, I must practice Dharma. This word Dharma, for those of you who are new, refers to the Buddha's teachings. It's kind of taking, and you can use it to refer to any spiritual teachings. If the Buddha's teachings aren't your thing, well, then you have to practice whatever spiritual path you're on. Devote time and energy into that, because death is going to come. You're not going to be able to keep from dying. It's a reality that we all have to face. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover for today. Let me share with you these meditations real quick. Again, I'm sorry that I've gone through things a bit quickly on that last part, but you do have the opportunity here. Did I share those meditations? So what I wanted to do was share the Google Drive. Sorry. Let me go to the Google Drive. Most of you may have accessed this already through the link that you have on the website. But I have here set up for Heart Advice for Death and Dying. I have here the meditations. Whoops, that's not the right thing. Sorry, I'm putting the wrong one on there. Is this it? Heart Advice for Death and Dying. This is it. Okay. General course information. Again, those were the 4 things that I went through: the recommended readings, the course outline, and then the reading assignments. So I don't need to show them again. I'm going to put here the slides as well from today, what I showed you in slides. This is the little handout that gives you some idea of meditation posture. If this is something that you're new to, that you don't know much about meditation posture, there's the 7-point meditation posture that you can take a look at, and you can ask me questions next week if there's any issues on that. This is the meditation on impermanence that we alluded to earlier, the fact that everything that's caused is changing moment by moment. It's a nice little investigation to kind of get our minds into that. If you can spend some time meditating on that, that would be good.
We can't see your screen.
Oh, you can't. I'm sorry. I didn't do the screen share. I just changed documents. Sorry. Okay. Thank you. I've been doing that's not the right one either. Getting rushed here at the end, sorry. General course information. Okay. All right. No, that's not it. But I think this is going to get me to the same thing. Yeah, this is fine. You can find it on the Google Drive, but you're going to find essentially, again, this meditation posture document that gives you information on meditation. You're also going to find meditation on impermanence. Is that showing up there now? Yes? Okay. This is, again, the one I alluded to earlier that talks about kind of examining all the things around us, our own minds even. Again, I won't spend much time looking at that. This is the one that goes through what I just went through very briefly. These 3 points, and let me make this a little bit larger so we can all take a look at it. Everyone has to die. And there's some nice points that you can reflect on in regard to that. Your lifespan is decreasing continuously. And then the amount of time you have for spiritual practice is very small. And then kind of the conclusion and a sort of dedication. So these written up meditations are really useful. You might find them a little distracting initially, but you might read them through a few times to get familiar with the points. And then when you sit down to meditate, you can, bring those points to mind. But you might spend just one session on each of those points. Don't think that you have to go through them all in a single session. And by a meditation session, I'm meaning you can just be sitting on your couch, just kind of sitting and thinking. Turn off all the distractions, the phones, the music, whatever, and just sit quietly and investigate these topics. This is how we'll actually begin to kind of get our heads around this topic of death. This death awareness meditation is a tried and true proven method from centuries of people examining death in this way. So these first 3 points are really important to get that to sink home, that death is inevitable for each and every one of us, particularly for me. That's the whole point, is to bring it really home to ourselves. Any final comments or questions today? Again, sorry for rushing through things a bit at the end here, but we run out of time, and I don't want to keep you all here too late. I'm notorious for doing that. So, okay. No questions, no comments, no criticisms. I'm open to criticisms too.
Just thank you so much, everyone, and Dawn.
Oh, you're welcome, Danny. Appreciate the comment. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dedicate, but again, if you can spend a little bit of time, I will post all the documents for next week out on that drive as well. So you're welcome to kind of read in advance and maybe take a look at the meditations that are coming up. But if you can spend some time, especially with what we talked about today, that will be really quite useful. So let's do the dedication prayers. If you could get that on the screen, Shayla. This is a wonderful dedication prayer that we do, and we're not going to have time to do the prayer around averting war, creating, pacifying the danger of weapons, which I like to do. There's also even, of course, things happening in terms of new viruses out there. Well, not new, but viruses that are springing up. The World Health Organization just declared the Ebola virus outbreak in Africa to be of a global health concern. And we had the hantavirus thing. So there's lots of stuff to pray that we have healing of that in our world, for the suffering that can be averted through our strong dedications and prayers. But as we recite these verses together, think that we're kind of creating the causes for the most ideal conditions, lessening of suffering in our world for all the beings in it and for our planet itself as well. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And we'll recite the prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's good health and long life, and for all his prayers to be fulfilled immediately. As we recite this, think that we're also creating the causes for all of our teachers to remain in this world as guides for us and others. Also, we can think about creating the causes for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation to be identified quickly so we can benefit from his presence in this world once again. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Okay, thank you, Shayla. Appreciate your help with that. And again, next week we'll have another class, the second in this series. We'll skip to 2 weeks again for the next class, but please do come in 2 weeks for the Sakadawa practice. It'll be kind of a nice time, nice occasion to get together. And there'll be hopefully some sharing of some of the video of what transpired today. It was an impossibility for me to get there. It was at 1:30 to 3 in the morning, I think, I would have had to have been up to watch the initial talk given by Ken Rinpoche Geshe Chonyi, who's the abbot of Kopan Monastery. We're kind of, again, kicking off this whole global campaign. There'll be more information coming from the center, as well as we'll hopefully have some additional practice sessions. It's also something you can begin doing on your own. There's a Facebook page for it. I don't know if there's other media, social media on it, but you can find out more about it at the FPMT's website as well. So thank you all, everyone. Have a good week. Please do come back next Sunday. I want you to be still alive. Continue to give you teachings on death and dying. Whenever death comes, we'll be prepared, but hopefully not before next week. So be well.